Thank you. My original birth certificate reads Shelley Marie. I was the unexpected child, birthed by a white woman who was unaware of her pregnancy and was married to a white man who was at first suspected to be my biological father. However, shortly after I was born, because of the darker color of my skin, it became aware that my biological father was a different man, a black man that my biological mother confessed to having an affair with. So it was at this point, just days after I was born, that I was given up for adoption, and I was adopted into the home of a loving couple named Bert and Nancy Dieter. They had already adopted another child named Molly, who would be my sister. I was then given the name Katie Eleanor Dieter. The story of my birth is rather new information for me, as Indiana recently allowed certain adoptees to file to receive their original birth certificates. When I was growing up, I always knew that I was adopted. My parents never hid that from me, which may have been difficult for them to do. I was very close with my father, Bert Dieter, who passed away on March 4th, 2016. My father died on my birthday, exactly 6 years ago today. So today, as I celebrate the day that I was born, I also celebrate the legacy that he left behind. Today I'm going to talk to you all about my child experiences on the playground and how that led me to discovering Black studies. Through these experiences, I now weave together personal story and art using creative autoethnography to help heal from the past and to build a brighter future. During the 1970s and 80s, my father, along with his business partner, Charlie Gibson, owned a playground corporation called Creative Playgrounds. They designed and built playgrounds all over Vigo County in Indiana. My dad also built a massive playground in our backyard when we were growing up. I recall the wonder and amazement that filled our backyard through these playgrounds that consisted of large metal sculptures, towers, swings, and slides, all a breeding ground for my sister and I to use our imagination through endless play. Now, the world began to look very different when I entered elementary school, and I began to realize that my skin contrasted with the other children at school, being that my sister and I were two of the only people of color at our elementary school. Different from the fun and safe playground that I was used to being on at home, the elementary school's playground offered a different view of the world. This playground was where I first learned about the functioning of race in American society. I recall a child telling me that I should be their slave. Another child would tell me that she couldn't play ball with me because her parents told her not to play with Black children. Through the years, other children would make negative comments about the color of my skin, or the broadness of my nose, my curly hair. The lack of access to process these issues with other Black people resulted in an enormous amount of shame. Around the same time, my father started a position as an art teacher at a local school for at-risk youth. I spent a lot of time in his classroom with him and my sister creating art. He taught us how to paint, weld, sculpt, how to throw a pot on a potter's wheel, woodworking. I always felt an enormous amount of peace when I was creating art with him. and the arts became a method of healing for me, a way to reimagine the confusing and hurtful world that existed outside of my safe backyard playground. When I graduated high school, I decided that I wanted to be an art teacher, just like my dad. And so I went into undergrad, majoring in studio art with an emphasis in metal sculpture and furniture design. During my first year, I signed up for an Introduction to African American Studies class to fulfill a diversity elective credit. From that first day in class, I felt as though I had been awakened, and I decided to add African and African American Studies as a second major. Black Studies taught me to understand my own experiences as existing within a larger system of structural oppression. And I began to realize that although my childhood was unique in many ways, it also reflected so much of the experiences of other Black people in the United States and abroad. And I began to feel a sense of understanding and belonging. From then, I spent my early adulthood years learning and making art and studying the historical, social, political, and cultural meanings of Blackness in Africa and the diaspora. I had a strong urge to build upon the work of Black Studies scholars and artists and continue to merge these two fields that mean so much to me. Art making allowed me to imagine without limits, and Black Studies taught me how to understand my own positionality in the world. However, I still felt as though something was missing. The lack of visibility that I experienced as a child was still present. Detouring from my original plan of going to graduate school for art, I decided to come to Indiana University to the graduate program in African American and African Diaspora Studies. When I entered graduate school, I had a longing desire to connect my passion for Black studies, visual art, and personal story and experience in a meaningful way. How could I connect with others and reimagine a world through Black studies and art making? Creative autoethnography. Now, to understand creative autoethnography, let's explore what autoethnography is. According to autoethnographers Robin Boylorn and Mark Orb, autoethnography refers to both the methods and product of researching and writing about personal lived experiences and their relationship to culture. Autoethnographers are not simply telling stories. They are writing about their own personal lived experiences and their relationship to culture or larger systems of oppression. Communication and autoethnographic scholars Carolyn Ellis and Tony Adams came up with 6 principles of autoethnography, some of which include the use of personal experience to describe and critique cultural experience, familiarity with existing research, breaking silence and reclaiming voice, and writing accessible prose. Some may argue that this approach is not academic enough, but Black Studies work pushes back against this notion, and the method of autoethnography further resists the idea that our stories, our experiences, and our lives don't matter. Black stories remain widely marginalized within our institutions, particularly within the world of academia and education. And the method of autoethnography seeks to correct this exclusion. Creative autoethnography is the combination of autoethnography with creativity, which can allow for endless possibilities for us to illustrate and reimagine our experiences, with the hope of connecting with communities by allowing for a centering of ourselves within academic research. Black studies and creative autoethnography taught me to better understand my own experiences as existing within a larger cultural framework. Since childhood, art had been a way to help me navigate the things I didn't fully understand. In an interview with Vanity Fair magazine in 2020, activist and scholar Angela Davis said, "In my mind, it's art that can begin to make us feel what we don't necessarily yet understand." This quote can help us think about how important the arts are in describing the Black experience and sharing our stories. Black art forms are methods of knowledge production, and as Davis points out, can help us feel what we don't necessarily yet understand. In 2016, the same year that my father died, I moved to Kingston, Jamaica to begin a position as a lecturer at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts. I had attended Kingston the year prior to attend the Rex Nettleford Arts Conference with IU's African American Dance Company, and I fell deeply in love with Jamaica. My father died before he could see me live out my dreams of moving to this beautiful place. I interviewed for the position just a week after his death. In an effort to make visual meaning out of this life-changing experience of moving to a new country shortly after the death of my father, I used creative autoethnography to make this piece titled, "This Remains." This remains generally speaks to the things that are left behind, and its inspiration comes from multiple sources. The death of my father was heavy on my mind, being that he had died just months before my relocation. I longed to talk to him about the classes I was teaching at the Arts College. I wanted to show him some of the work of my talented students. I had a deep desire to hear his advice about all of the new challenges that were coming my way. And I desperately wanted to hear the excitement in his voice when I told him about all of the experiences I was having in my new home. At the same time, I was confronted with the legacy of slavery and colonialism in Jamaica. I was thinking a lot about what had been left behind when slavery was abolished in 1838 and when Jamaica obtained independence from Britain in 1962. When I first moved to Jamaica, I was struggling with the functioning of their institutions, and I began to see these occurrences as remnants of the colonial structures that had been put in place decades prior. Many early paintings of Jamaica were by white British artists who sought to capture the beautiful landscapes, in part to justify the British colonial occupation on the island. Black figures were rarely present in these paintings, and if they were often depicted as slaves or workers or played no significant role in the piece other than to emphasize the surrounding environment. The piece This Remains recognizes these efforts to erase Black experiences or to minimize Blackness to singular oppressive conditions. This is often or very reminiscent of how I felt as a child, often feeling unworthy of fitting into the world around me. This is an example of how art can be used to tell a story, a creative, autoethnographic portrayal of my experiences interwoven with African diasporic history and culture. Black studies and creative autoethnography allow us to express ourselves and help us to imagine new futures. A place where our stories are centered, our lives matter, and our experiences have meaning. My early days on the playground were filled with wonder and imagination, but coupled with sadness and confusion about what it meant to be a Black person in this world. I encourage you all to think about your place on the playground as a child and now. Are you playing fairly? How are you contributing to the larger society? Are you the bully, or are you encouraging others and lifting them up? You have the power to change the dynamic of the actual and metaphorical playground for yourselves and for future generations. By using elements of creative autoethnography and a Black studies lens, you can begin to make a difference in the communities that you care about. Develop opportunities out of restrictions. Turn trauma into liberation, and find peace and meaning in grief. Thank you.